In modern warfare, reputation can be as powerful as weapons. For decades, the world's most powerful military, the United States, respected the elite soldiers of Britain's Special Air Service. But there was a moment when some American planners quietly wondered if the legendary reputation of the SAS was exaggerated. After all, Iraq in the mid-2000s was not a battlefield for myths. It was a brutal insurgency, filled with roadside bombs, suicide networks, and urban warfare that swallowed entire divisions of soldiers. When British SAS operators were assigned a critical mission in Baghdad, some Pentagon officials privately questioned whether such a small force could survive the chaos. What happened next would change that perception forever. Within months, the SAS would build one of the most lethal counter-terrorist hunting machines the modern world had ever seen. The results were so effective that American commanders would later admit something surprising. They had never seen anything quite like it. And after that operation, the Pentagon never underestimated the British SAS again. The legend of the Special Air Service did not begin in Iraq. Long before the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the SAS had already carved its name into military history as one of the most elite and unconventional fighting forces ever created. The unit was born during the chaos of World War II in the deserts of North Africa. In 1941, a young British officer named David Stirling proposed an idea that many traditional commanders initially thought was absurd. Rather than relying on large formations of soldiers attacking head-on, Stirling believed that small groups of highly trained commandos could infiltrate deep behind enemy lines and destroy critical targets. Airfields, fuel depots, aircraft, anything that gave the enemy an advantage. The concept was radical for its time. War in that era was still dominated by divisions, brigades, and mass formations. But Stirling's idea focused on precision rather than numbers. Thus, the Special Air Service was born. Operating in small teams, the early SAS units conducted daring raids across the North African desert. Who dares wins. It was not simply a slogan. It was a philosophy that shaped every operation the regiment conducted. After World War II, many nations began forming their own special forces units. But the SAS remained one of the most respected. By the 1970s and 1980s, the regiment had gained global recognition for its counter-terrorism capabilities. One operation in particular cemented their reputation. In April 1980, 6 armed militants stormed the Iranian embassy in London, taking dozens of hostages. For 6 tense days, British authorities negotiated with the terrorists while preparing a military response. When negotiations collapsed, the SAS was sent in. The assault lasted just minutes. Operators rappelled down the building, blew through windows with explosives, and stormed the rooms where the gunmen were holding hostages. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. The hostages were rescued. The operation was broadcast live on television around the world, turning the SAS into an international symbol of elite special forces capability. From that moment on, the regiment became the gold standard for counter-terrorism units. Their influence could be seen in the creation and development of other famous units, including America's own elite forces. In fact, when the United States began expanding its modern special operations capabilities after the failed Iranian hostage rescue attempt in 1980, American planners closely studied the British model. Units such as Delta Force were heavily influenced by SAS training and doctrine. This close relationship between American and British special forces would grow even stronger over the next several decades. The two nations frequently trained together, shared intelligence, and conducted joint operations. By the time the War on Terror began after the attacks of September 11, 2001, the partnership between British and American Special Operations Forces was stronger than ever. In Afghanistan, SAS operators worked closely alongside American units to hunt Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders. But the war in Iraq would present a completely different kind of battlefield. Afghanistan's rugged mountains allowed insurgent groups to hide in remote areas, but Iraq's insurgency was largely urban. Cities like Baghdad became battlegrounds filled with roadside bombs, ambushes, kidnappings, and suicide attacks. The enemy did not wear uniforms. They blended into the civilian population, building networks of bomb makers, financiers, and recruiters. This made the conflict incredibly complex. Traditional military operations struggled to stop the insurgency because the enemy was not concentrated in one place. Instead, the insurgency functioned more like a web. Remove one member, and another would quickly take their place. American commanders soon realized that defeating such networks required a new approach. Instead of large military offensives, the focus had to shift toward intelligence-driven operations targeting key individuals within terrorist organizations. This approach required speed, precision, and constant pressure. Special operations forces became the primary tool for carrying out this strategy. By the mid-2000s, the United States had already deployed several elite units to Iraq. But the situation in Baghdad was rapidly deteriorating. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had transformed the capital into one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Bombings and assassinations occurred daily. Sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia militias pushed the country closer to civil war. The insurgent networks operating in Baghdad had grown highly sophisticated. They ran bomb-making factories, organized suicide attacks, and coordinated kidnappings across the city. Stopping them required more than just patrols and checkpoints. It required dismantling the entire leadership structure of the insurgency. This meant identifying key leaders, tracking their movements, capturing them alive when possible, and extracting intelligence that could lead to the next target. The strategy depended on speed. Information gathered during one raid had to be analyzed immediately so that follow-up operations could happen within hours, not days. The faster this cycle moved, the less time insurgent leaders had to escape. American Special Operations units had already begun implementing this strategy with increasing success. But Baghdad's insurgent networks remained resilient. Then British Special Forces arrived with a slightly different approach. Within the British military, the SAS had long developed a reputation for operating quietly but effectively in complex environments. Their experience in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and Afghanistan had given them deep expertise in intelligence-driven counter-terrorism operations. When SAS units were deployed to Iraq, their mission was not simply to support American forces. They were tasked with helping dismantle the insurgent networks operating in Baghdad. At first glance, the numbers involved seemed surprisingly small. The SAS force operating in Baghdad was tiny compared to the thousands of American troops stationed across the city. Some American planners quietly wondered how much impact such a small group of operators could realistically have. But the SAS had always relied on a different formula: precision instead of mass, intelligence instead of brute force, and speed above all else. Within months, the British would demonstrate just how powerful that formula could be. Because in the shadow war being fought across Baghdad's streets, a new kind of operational machine was about to emerge. One that would redefine how modern counterterrorism operations were conducted. And once American commanders saw the results, their perception of the SAS would change permanently. By 2005, the war in Iraq had entered one of its most dangerous phases. What had initially been a conventional invasion had transformed into a brutal insurgency spreading across the country. But nowhere was the violence more intense than in Baghdad. Every day, roadside bombs detonated beneath military convoys. Suicide attackers targeted police stations, markets, and government offices. Kidnappings became a routine weapon of terror. Behind much of the violence was a ruthless organization known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Led by the Jordanian militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the group specialized in extreme brutality. Zarqawi understood that Iraq's deep sectarian tensions could be turned into a weapon. By targeting both Shia civilians and coalition forces, his network aimed to ignite a civil war that would tear the country apart. And in many ways, it was working. Baghdad had become a city under siege. Intelligence reports showed that insurgent cells were operating across nearly every district. These groups were not isolated fighters hiding in caves. They were organized networks with bomb makers, couriers, financiers, safe houses, and recruiters. Each attack required planning, communication, and coordination. If coalition forces could dismantle those networks fast enough, the attacks might slow. But the challenge was enormous. Traditional military operations were not designed to hunt shadowy networks operating inside crowded cities. Large troop movements often produced limited results because insurgents simply vanished into the civilian population. American commanders began developing a new strategy. Instead of focusing on territory, the focus would be on people. The key was intelligence. If analysts could identify the leaders of insurgent networks, special operations units could strike quickly, capture them, and extract information that might lead to the next target. The process became known as the find, fix, finish cycle. Find the target through intelligence. Fix their location through surveillance. Finish the mission through a precise raid. Then immediately exploit any intelligence recovered during the operation. Captured phones, documents, computers, and interrogation reports could reveal the next set of targets. If the cycle moved fast enough, entire networks could collapse within days. This approach required elite forces capable of conducting multiple raids every night with extreme precision. And this was where British Special Forces entered the picture. The SAS units deployed to Iraq were grouped into a highly secretive formation known as Task Force Black. Operating primarily in Baghdad, Task Force Black would become one of the most aggressive counter-terrorism forces in the entire war. But their arrival was not without skepticism. Some American planners believed the SAS had an impressive historical reputation, but wondered whether the small British force could truly make a difference in a conflict as chaotic as Iraq. Baghdad was not Northern Ireland. It was not the Falklands. And it was certainly not the deserts of North Africa. This was a sprawling megacity filled with insurgent networks that had already proven capable of killing thousands of soldiers and civilians. Some within the Pentagon privately questioned whether a relatively small British task force could keep up with the relentless pace of operations required. But the SAS had something many outsiders underestimated: decades of experience in intelligence-driven warfare. During the conflict in Northern Ireland, British Special Forces had spent years tracking clandestine militant networks. The battlefield there was not open terrain. It was a dense web of safe houses, informants, and covert operations. Operators had learned how to track individuals through surveillance, build intelligence profiles, and dismantle underground organizations piece by piece. These skills would prove extremely valuable in Iraq. Task Force Black established its headquarters inside Baghdad's fortified Green Zone, the heavily defended area housing coalition leadership and diplomatic compounds. From there, SAS operators began building a picture of the insurgent landscape. They worked closely with intelligence analysts, signals intercept teams, and surveillance units. Phones were tracked. Safe houses were mapped. Couriers were monitored. The goal was not simply to raid random buildings. Every operation had to be based on solid intelligence. Once a target was identified, surveillance teams would watch the location, sometimes for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the operation began, speed was everything. Helicopters carrying assault teams would sweep into the area at night. Vehicles would block nearby streets. Entry teams would breach doors or windows and flood into the building. Inside, the objective was to capture the target alive whenever possible. Interrogations could reveal enormous amounts of information: phone numbers, addresses, meeting locations, and contacts. Every piece of intelligence could trigger another operation. This created a relentless cycle of raids that began to pressure insurgent networks across Baghdad. But Task Force Black had another advantage. Unlike large military formations that required layers of approval, the SAS often operated with remarkable autonomy. Their command structure was streamlined. Decisions could be made quickly. Targets identified in the afternoon could be raided that same night. This tempo shocked many observers. Some nights involved multiple operations in different parts of the city. Helicopters landing, operators storming buildings, detainees being transported back for interrogation, analysts immediately processing new intelligence. Then another mission would launch hours later. The system was designed to keep insurgent networks constantly off balance. Leaders could never feel safe. A safe house that seemed secure one evening might be raided before dawn. Over time, this pressure began to produce results. Key bomb makers were captured. Courier networks were dismantled. Weapons caches were discovered across the city, but the most important victories were often invisible to the public. Every captured insurgent could reveal connections to several others, and those connections led to new targets. Within months, Task Force Black had begun penetrating deep into the structure of insurgent organizations operating in Baghdad. Their intelligence picture was becoming clearer and more detailed. But this progress did not come without friction. Relations between British and American command structures occasionally became strained. Some disagreements emerged over operational priorities and intelligence sharing. At times, American commanders believed the SAS was focusing too narrowly on certain targets while ignoring others. Meanwhile, British officers believed that some American operations lacked the precise intelligence required for effective counterterrorism work. These tensions were not unusual in coalition warfare. Different military cultures often approach problems in different ways. But despite the disagreements, the results of Task Force Black's operations were becoming impossible to ignore. Reports began circulating among coalition commanders. Insurgent leaders who had previously evaded capture for months were suddenly disappearing. Bomb-making networks were collapsing. Kidnapping rings were being dismantled. American units operating in Baghdad started noticing a change. The flow of intelligence coming from SAS operations was incredibly detailed. Captured documents and phone data began linking together pieces of the insurgent puzzle that had previously seemed disconnected. Slowly, a larger picture emerged. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not a loose collection of militants. It was a highly organized structure with regional commanders, logistical networks, and communication chains connecting cells across the country. And the SAS had begun to map that structure. By identifying the key nodes within the network, Task Force Black could strike at the most critical individuals rather than simply chasing foot soldiers. But the real turning point was still coming, because soon, Task Force Black would become part of a much larger and far more powerful machine. A joint British-American counterterrorism force that would conduct one of the most relentless special operations campaigns in modern military history. And once that machine was fully operational, the results would astonish even the most experienced commanders inside the Pentagon. The pace of raids would increase. The intelligence cycle would accelerate. And insurgent leaders across Baghdad would begin to realize something terrifying. Someone was hunting them, and the hunters were getting closer every night. By late 2005, the war in Baghdad had become a relentless contest of intelligence and speed. Insurgent groups continued launching attacks across the city, but coalition forces were slowly learning how those networks functioned. The battlefield was no longer defined by streets or neighborhoods. It was defined by information. Every captured phone number, every intercepted call, every seized laptop revealed another piece of the insurgent puzzle. But gathering intelligence alone was not enough. The real challenge was turning that information into action fast enough to disrupt the networks before they could adapt. That required a new level of coordination between intelligence analysts and special operations units. And in Iraq, that coordination was beginning to reach unprecedented levels. American Special Operations Forces had already begun building a highly aggressive counterterrorism system under the leadership of the Joint Special Operations Command. JSOC units were conducting targeted raids across the country, focusing on the leadership of insurgent organizations. But when British SAS operators integrated their operations with these American units, the tempo of the campaign began to accelerate dramatically. Task Force Black became closely linked with the American counterterrorism network that included elite forces such as Delta Force, Rangers, and specialized intelligence teams. The combined system began functioning almost like an industrial production line. Except instead of producing machines, it produced raids. Every day, intelligence teams processed massive streams of information collected from surveillance drones, intercepted communications, informant networks, and captured insurgents. Analysts worked around the clock, mapping connections between individuals. Who called who met with whom, which safe houses were linked to which bomb-making cells. Each new data point strengthened the intelligence picture. Then the targets were selected. Once a target was approved, surveillance teams began monitoring the location. Sometimes it was a house. sometimes an apartment, sometimes a vehicle moving through the streets of Baghdad. When the moment was right, the operation began. Helicopters lifted assault teams into the night sky. Convoys of armored vehicles moved through darkened streets. Operators approached the target building silently, often under the cover of darkness. Then, within seconds, the quiet exploded into controlled violence. Doors shattered. Flash grenades detonated. Operators stormed into rooms before the occupants even realized what was happening. The objective was always speed and control. Most raids lasted only minutes. If the target was present, he was captured immediately. If resistance occurred, operators responded with overwhelming force. But the real objective came after the raid. Inside the building, operators collected everything that might contain intelligence: phones, computers, documents, memory cards, sometimes even scraps of paper with handwritten notes. All of it was transported back to intelligence centers for immediate analysis. This was where the system truly revealed its power. Within hours, analysts could extract phone numbers from captured devices and cross-reference them with existing databases. Connections began appearing almost instantly. One captured phone might link to several other insurgent operatives. Those operatives had their own contacts. Those contacts had safe houses. Each new connection created another target. And because the system operated continuously, new raids could launch the very same night based on intelligence gathered just hours earlier. This rapid cycle began devastating insurgent networks. Leaders who believed they were operating safely inside Baghdad suddenly found themselves exposed. Safe houses that had never been compromised were suddenly raided. Meetings that were meant to remain secret were interrupted by special operations teams crashing through the doors. The pressure on insurgent organizations began to intensify. Commanders were captured. Bomb makers disappeared. Courier networks were dismantled. And as the cycle accelerated, the insurgents found it increasingly difficult to rebuild. For American commanders observing the campaign, the speed of the operations was remarkable. In earlier stages of the war, raids might be planned over several days. Now they could happen within hours. Sometimes dozens of operations occurred within a single week. Task Force Black played a critical role in this machine. SAS operators were particularly effective in urban environments, where precise intelligence and disciplined execution were essential. Their teams specialized in rapid entry tactics and close-quarters combat, skills that were vital during night raids in dense neighborhoods. But what impressed many American observers even more was the SAS approach to intelligence. British operators treated intelligence gathering as the heart of every mission. Capturing the right person alive could be more valuable than eliminating several lower-level fighters. Interrogations produced new leads. New leads produced new targets. The cycle continued. Over time, the intelligence map of insurgent networks in Baghdad became more detailed than ever before. Coalition analysts could identify entire chains of command inside Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They knew who built the bombs, who financed the operations, who recruited the suicide attackers, and most importantly, who coordinated the attacks. With this knowledge, the raids became increasingly precise. Instead of targeting random suspects, operations focused on the most critical individuals within the network. These were the people who kept the insurgency functioning. Remove them, and the organization struggled to replace their expertise. Bomb makers were particularly valuable targets. Building sophisticated improvised explosive devices required specialized knowledge. When experienced bomb makers were captured or killed, attacks often decreased in the areas where they had operated. Another priority was the courier networks. Insurgent groups relied heavily on human messengers to move information between cells. By intercepting couriers and analyzing their contacts, intelligence teams could uncover entire sections of the network. Every successful raid created a ripple effect. A single captured insurgent might expose 5 more operatives. Those 5 could expose 20 more. Gradually, the structure of the insurgency began weakening. But the campaign was not without risks. Operating in Baghdad's neighborhoods at night meant entering extremely dangerous environments. Many insurgents were heavily armed. Some safe houses were fortified. Others were filled with explosives designed to kill anyone who attempted to enter. Ambushes were always possible. Helicopters flying low over the city risked being targeted by heavy machine guns or rocket-propelled grenades. Despite these dangers, the tempo of operations continued increasing. Night after night, special operations teams launched missions across the city. For insurgent leaders, the psychological pressure became intense. They knew someone was hunting them. Phones were abandoned. Safe houses were moved frequently. Meetings became shorter and more secretive. But the intelligence network tracking them continued growing stronger. The system had become too fast, too interconnected, too relentless. Within military circles, reports began circulating about the extraordinary pace of the counter-terrorism campaign. American officers noticed something important. Whenever SAS teams were involved in an operation, the results were often exceptionally precise. Targets that had evaded capture for months suddenly disappeared from the insurgent battlefield. The effectiveness of Task Force Black was no longer a quiet rumor. It had become a recognized reality. Inside the Pentagon, analysts studying the Iraq conflict began reviewing the operational data. They saw the same pattern repeated again and again. Small teams of highly trained operators, supported by powerful intelligence networks, were dismantling insurgent structures at an incredible rate. The SAS had proven that even a relatively small force could have a massive impact if it operated with the right strategy. But the most dramatic moment of the campaign was still approaching, because the network they were hunting had a leader, a man whose brutality had shocked the world, a man responsible for countless bombings, executions, and attacks across Iraq. And when the intelligence machine finally closed in on him, the operation that followed would become one of the most significant turning points of the entire war. It would also demonstrate, beyond any doubt, why the British SAS had earned their reputation, and why the Pentagon would never again underestimate them. By early 2006, the campaign against insurgent networks in Iraq had entered a new and decisive phase. Months of intelligence-driven operations had begun exposing the hidden structure of militant organizations operating across Baghdad. The relentless cycle of raids conducted by coalition special operations forces had captured dozens of bomb makers, couriers, financiers, and cell leaders. Each arrest revealed more information. Each interrogation exposed more connections. And slowly, the intelligence map of the insurgency was becoming clearer than it had ever been. But at the center of that network was one man whose name had become synonymous with violence in Iraq: Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was not just another insurgent commander. He was the founder and leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the organization responsible for some of the most brutal attacks of the entire war. His strategy was designed to tear Iraq apart by fueling sectarian hatred. Bombings targeted Shia mosques and marketplaces. Suicide attacks struck police stations and military checkpoints. Public executions were filmed and distributed online as propaganda. Zarqawi understood the power of fear, and by spreading terror across Iraq, he hoped to create chaos that would make the country ungovernable. Stopping him became one of the highest priorities for coalition forces. But finding Zarqawi was extraordinarily difficult. Unlike traditional military commanders who operated from fixed headquarters, Zarqawi constantly moved between safe houses. His communications were limited and carefully controlled. Only a small circle of trusted associates knew his exact location at any given time. For months, intelligence agencies had been trying to track him. Surveillance aircraft monitored suspected hideouts. Signals intelligence teams intercepted communications. Informants attempted to penetrate his network. Yet every time a possible lead emerged, Zarqawi managed to disappear. The problem was that his organization functioned like a shadow network. Even if coalition forces captured one operative, that person might only know a small portion of the overall structure. Breaking through that secrecy required sustained pressure on every level of the network. And this was exactly what the Joint Special Operations Campaign was beginning to achieve. Task Force Black and its American counterparts had spent months targeting mid-level leaders across Baghdad and other parts of Iraq. These individuals were not as famous as Zarqawi, but they were essential to the organization's daily operations. They organized bomb-making workshops. They coordinated attacks. They distributed money and weapons to insurgent cells. By systematically dismantling these positions, coalition forces were slowly isolating the senior leadership of the network. One captured courier might reveal the location of a meeting. A seized laptop might contain contact lists. A single phone call intercepted by intelligence teams could expose an entire chain of communication. Piece by piece, the circle around Zarqawi began tightening. But the campaign required patience. Counter-terrorism operations rarely deliver immediate results. Instead, they rely on a long process of collecting small fragments of intelligence and assembling them into a larger picture. That process was now reaching a critical point. Inside coalition intelligence centers, analysts began noticing patterns. Certain individuals repeatedly appeared in communication networks connected to Zarqawi's organization. Some were logistics coordinators. Others were facilitators responsible for moving fighters or arranging safe houses. These individuals became priority targets. Raids intensified. Night after night, special operations teams launched missions across the country. Sometimes the targets were captured. Sometimes they fought back. Sometimes they fled moments before the assault teams arrived. But every operation produced more intelligence. Documents were seized. Phones were analyzed. Detainees were interrogated. Gradually, the intelligence picture sharpened. The network protecting Zarqawi was beginning to unravel. One particularly important breakthrough came when coalition forces captured a senior facilitator connected to Zarqawi's inner circle. Unlike lower-level fighters, this individual possessed detailed knowledge of how the leadership moved and communicated. His interrogation revealed critical clues about the courier network responsible for protecting Zarqawi's location. These couriers were the lifeline of the organization. They carried messages between commanders while avoiding electronic communication that could be intercepted. Tracking them required intense surveillance and patience. But once identified, the couriers became one of the most valuable targets in the entire campaign. Task Force Black and other special operations units began focusing their efforts on this network. Surveillance teams monitored suspected meeting locations. Vehicles were tracked across multiple cities. Phones associated with the couriers were analyzed for patterns of movement. Eventually, the intelligence teams identified a man believed to be one of Zarqawi's closest associates. This individual was responsible for coordinating safe houses used by the Al-Qaeda leader. If coalition forces could track him, they might finally locate Zarqawi himself. The operation that followed demonstrated just how powerful the intelligence-driven strategy had become. Special operations teams began monitoring the suspect's movements carefully. Instead of immediately launching a raid, they allowed surveillance to continue. The goal was not simply to capture one man. The goal was to follow the network as far as possible. Days passed as analysts observed his contacts and movements. Eventually, he traveled to a rural area north of Baghdad. Intelligence officers immediately recognized the potential significance of the location. It was remote enough to serve as a safe meeting place, but it was still accessible to the insurgent networks operating in the region. Surveillance assets were quickly redirected to monitor the area. Signals intelligence teams began scanning communications, and slowly, a pattern began emerging. The suspect appeared to be coordinating a meeting. The question was with whom? For several tense hours, intelligence teams watched the compound. Vehicles arrived. Men entered the building. Communications traffic increased briefly before going silent. Everything about the activity suggested that someone important was present. Very important. At that moment, coalition commanders faced a critical decision. They could launch a ground assault immediately, or they could strike from the air. The risk of waiting was that the target might escape. But launching an assault without certainty could allow Zarqawi to slip away once again. The intelligence teams reviewed every piece of information available. Surveillance reports, signals intercepts, human intelligence. Finally, the decision was made. The compound would be struck from the air. Moments later, American aircraft approached the target location. Precision-guided bombs were released. The explosion shattered the quiet countryside. Within seconds, the compound was destroyed. Special operations teams moved quickly to secure the site. And when the wreckage was examined, the answer became clear. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was dead. The leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq had finally been eliminated. For coalition forces, the moment represented one of the most significant victories of the entire war. But the success had not come from a single dramatic raid. It was the result of months of relentless intelligence operations, hundreds of raids, thousands of hours of surveillance, countless pieces of information collected, analyzed, and connected together. Task Force Black had played an important role in that effort. Their operations against mid-level insurgent leaders had helped expose the structure of the network protecting Zarqawi. By dismantling those layers of protection, coalition forces had finally reached the center. Inside military headquarters across Iraq, the news spread quickly. The most feared insurgent leader in the country was gone. But perhaps more importantly, the campaign that led to his death had proven something fundamental about modern warfare. Small teams of elite operators, supported by powerful intelligence systems, could dismantle even the most dangerous terrorist networks. And within that campaign, the performance of the SAS had become impossible to ignore. American commanders who had once questioned how much impact such a small British force could have were now seeing the results clearly. The SAS had not simply contributed to the campaign. They had helped refine the strategy that made it successful. And inside the Pentagon, one conclusion was becoming increasingly obvious. The reputation of the British SAS was not exaggerated. If anything, it had been underestimated. But the full impact of their work in Iraq would only become clear in the years that followed, because the methods developed during that campaign would influence special operations forces around the world, and they would permanently change how the United States viewed its British allies in elite warfare. The death of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in 2006 marked a turning point in the Iraq War. For years, he had been the central figure driving Al-Qaeda's brutal campaign of bombings, executions, and sectarian violence. His strategy had been simple but devastating: ignite a civil war so violent that Iraq would collapse into chaos. Removing him did not instantly end the insurgency, but it delivered a powerful shock to the entire militant network. For the first time since the war had begun, the leadership structure of Al-Qaeda in Iraq had been seriously disrupted. The organization that once seemed unstoppable was suddenly vulnerable. Yet the most important achievement of the campaign was not the elimination of one man. It was the system that had made that victory possible. The intelligence-driven warfare developed during the hunt for insurgent leaders had proven something remarkable. Small teams of elite operators, working closely with analysts and surveillance networks, could dismantle terrorist organizations with incredible speed and precision. This strategy would soon become the blueprint for modern counter-terrorism operations. And within that system, the contribution of the British Special Air Service had become undeniable. Task Force Black had spent months striking at the middle layers of the insurgent network: the facilitators, the bomb makers, the couriers, and the planners who kept the organization running. These were the individuals who rarely appeared in headlines, but were essential to sustaining the insurgency. By removing them one by one, the SAS had helped expose the structure that protected the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Their operations did not rely on massive troop deployments or sweeping offensives. Instead, they focused on intelligence, precision, and speed. Every mission was designed to generate more information. Every arrest became an opportunity to locate the next target. Every seized phone or laptop became a map leading deeper into the network. This relentless pressure began to reshape the battlefield. Insurgent groups were forced to operate in constant fear of discovery. Safe houses became temporary refuges rather than secure bases. Meetings were shortened. Communications were limited. Leaders moved frequently, unsure whether they were already being watched. The psychological impact of this campaign was enormous. For insurgents operating in Baghdad and other cities, it often felt as if coalition forces knew their plans before they could execute them. Entire cells would suddenly disappear overnight. Commanders who believed they were operating safely within the city would find their doors blown open by special operations teams before dawn. The message was clear: no one inside the insurgent network was truly safe. And this pressure gradually weakened the ability of these organizations to coordinate large-scale attacks. Coalition commanders began noticing measurable changes. Bomb-making operations were disrupted more frequently. Communication networks were fractured. Operational planning became more chaotic. Although the insurgency continued to fight, it was increasingly forced into a defensive posture. But inside military headquarters, another realization was spreading. The campaign had demonstrated something extraordinary about special operations warfare. In the past, large conventional forces had often been seen as the primary tool for defeating insurgencies. Massive troop deployments, large-scale offensives, and heavy firepower were considered essential to controlling territory. Yet the operations conducted by Task Force Black and its American counterparts had shown that intelligence-driven precision could achieve effects far beyond what their small numbers suggested. A relatively tiny force had managed to strike hundreds of targets, dismantle entire networks, and contribute to the elimination of the most dangerous terrorist leader in Iraq. For senior officers within the United States military, this was an important lesson, and it forced many of them to reconsider earlier assumptions about the capabilities of the British SAS. Before the Iraq War, the SAS already enjoyed a legendary reputation among military professionals. Stories of their operations in World War II, Northern Ireland, and various covert missions around the world had circulated for decades. But some American planners had quietly wondered whether those stories had grown larger than reality. After all, legends often become exaggerated over time. Yet the operations in Iraq had provided clear, measurable evidence. The SAS were not simply living off past achievements. They were actively shaping the future of modern warfare. American officers who worked alongside them frequently noted their discipline, adaptability, and precision. SAS operators were known for their calm professionalism during high-risk missions. They emphasized preparation and intelligence gathering rather than relying purely on aggression. Their approach to counter-terrorism emphasized understanding the enemy network in detail before striking. This mindset proved extremely effective in the complex environment of Iraq. It also strengthened the relationship between British and American Special Operations Forces. Joint missions became more common. Training exchanges expanded. Operational methods were shared and refined. The collaboration between the two countries helped create one of the most effective counter-terrorism systems the world had ever seen. Inside the Pentagon, analysts studying the Iraq campaign began compiling reports on the lessons learned. These reports examined everything from intelligence coordination to the speed of the raid cycle. Again and again, the same conclusion appeared. Success had come from integration. Intelligence agencies, surveillance systems, and special operations forces working together in a continuous loop. Find the target. Fix the location. Finish the operation. Exploit the intelligence. Repeat. The SAS had demonstrated how powerful that cycle could become when executed with precision. Their experience in intelligence-driven warfare had helped refine the system and push it to extraordinary levels of efficiency. For many American commanders, the result was a profound respect for the British regiment. Some had entered the Iraq War viewing the SAS as a legendary but relatively small ally. By the end of the campaign, they saw them as one of the most effective special operations forces in the world. That shift in perception would influence military cooperation for years to come. Joint counter-terrorism operations expanded in Afghanistan and other regions. Training programs increasingly incorporated lessons learned from the Iraq campaign. The methods developed during that period became standard practice for elite units across multiple countries. But perhaps the most important legacy was the recognition that reputation alone does not sustain elite status. Performance does. And in Iraq, the SAS had demonstrated their capabilities in one of the most dangerous operational environments of the modern era. They had faced a ruthless insurgency operating inside crowded cities. They had conducted hundreds of high-risk missions under constant threat of ambush and explosives. And through it all, they had helped dismantle one of the most violent terrorist networks in the world. By the time the war in Iraq began evolving into a new phase, the SAS had already secured their place in its history. Their role was rarely discussed publicly. Much of their work remained classified. Many of the operations they conducted would never appear in official reports or news headlines. Yet within military circles, the impact of their campaign was well understood. The results spoke for themselves. And inside the Pentagon, the lesson had been learned. The British Special Air Service was not simply a legendary unit remembered for its past. It was an elite force capable of shaping the battlefield in the present. A force that could dismantle networks, hunt terrorist leaders, and operate with a level of precision that few others could match. After Iraq, no one in the American defense establishment doubted that reality, because the war had provided the proof. And from that point forward, one thing became certain. The Pentagon would never underestimate the British SAS again.